Hello, and welcome to Interviewing Ins and Outs. My name is Kim Martman, and I am an employment specialist here at the Senior Source. And so in this seminar, we go over 6 different types of interviews. We'll start with the screening interviews, phone interviews, group interviews, panel interviews, traditional interviews, and virtual interviews. So a screening interview is usually pretty quick. The purpose is to narrow the list for the next step, so it's probably not going to get into a whole lot of depth. It's usually held by recruiters or hiring managers, so someone like an immediate boss or someone from the department that's hiring from that job might not be at the screening interview. It just depends on the company. The focus tends to be on qualifications and skills. So you're probably not going to see a behavioral question or anything like that. It's going to be more on the hard skills and the qualifications. And so they might go down your resume and just inquire about any gaps or inconsistencies in your resume, if there are any, or again, just about your qualifications and your skills and your job history. So the phone interviews are usually pretty brief. They are often a screening interview, so if they really wanted to get into depth, they would probably want to see you in person. And despite this, you would research and prepare just like you would an in-person interview, of course. And I think that would also include getting dressed up as you would an in-person interview, because that also kind of puts you in the mindset of having an interview. And if you're using a cell phone, of course, make sure you are in a place with good reception. Now, group interviews, and these can be difficult. You will be one of many interviewees, so there's usually more than one person doing the interview, more than one company representative interviewing, but there are many people being interviewed, as you can see in this graphic here. The companies find these more efficient, but they also use it as a way to observe people skills and just how people interact with each other. The travel industry is pretty infamous for using these as well, and the VA as well. And interviewers may just ask applicants questions, or they may give the group an activity that may or may not be related to the job. And the reasoning behind that, again, is just to see how people interact with others, who takes the leadership role, who's more of a follower, who's kind of diplomatic, and just different things like that, because that way they can actually see rather than asking questions about it. They get to see with their own eyes. So special tips for group interviews. And listen to other interviewees, of course, but try not to compare yourself to them. And always remain positive toward not only them, but yourself as well. And sometimes that's hard because you're trying to think up an answer to a question, and maybe somebody comes up with a better answer than you came up with, or they said the same thing that you wanted to say. Give others the opportunity to speak and do not interrupt them. And sometimes we are anticipating what we're going to say and kind of get ahead of ourselves, so just kind of be careful about that. And it is perfectly okay to take someone else's answer and expand upon it to make it your own. Always, if the interviewer was asked for volunteers, always volunteer. Even if you're more introverted and it's maybe not in your nature, it's going a little bit outside your comfort zone, always volunteer and show that kind of initiative. And always participate actively, again, even if leadership is not necessarily your strong suit. So a panel interview. You will be interviewed by more than one person. Group interviews are also often panel interviews, but sometimes panel interviews have many interviewers and just one interviewee, just like in this graphic here. And they may include several different people, maybe the immediate boss, the hiring manager, maybe some of the recruiters that you might have spoken to in the process, maybe even some potential coworkers or someone from another department that's completely unrelated. They might pull in the IT guy or something like that if it's something totally unrelated to the job. Just it might include a wide variety of people. And employers are starting to prefer panel interviews because it makes the process quicker and more efficient. That way they don't have to call you in for all those separate interviews. They are all seeing you at once. So some of our special tips for panel interviews. Be sure to get the names and business cards of everyone on the panel, and usually they would start out by introducing themselves and offering a business card. But once you get those business cards, arrange them on the table in front of you in the order their owners are sitting, so that way you don't have to remember all their names and their job titles. And if you can't get business cards, of course, don't be afraid to jot down their names. It makes you look engaged and no one would think anything of it if you did. So when you're asked a question, you can use the asker's name in the answer and start out by making eye contact with the person who originally asked the question. But as you answer the question, try and get eye contact with the rest of the panel members and then end with the person who asked the original question. That way you engage everybody at the table. And yes, that can be difficult at times, but that's a very easy way to do it. But you do want to engage everybody who is on that panel. And don't be afraid to cross-reference earlier questions and elaborate more to make them relevant to the question at hand. And that can also depend on who the person is who is asking the question, because they might be looking for different things than another person on the panel would be. They would have a different set of interests. So a traditional interview, and this is what we're all most familiar with when we think about a job interview, it's usually one-on-one with an interviewer, and it usually is more resume focused, but it can include behavioral questions, and we're going to get more into those later because those are becoming more and more commonplace in the job interviews. And they are becoming less frequent as employers lean more toward other methods. They are still being used very widely. It's just that we're also starting to see more other methods being. So we are seeing more and more virtual interviews in the most recent years, and they are becoming more and more commonplace because they are easier for interviewers. Maybe they have somebody who is in a remote office and they don't want to have the expense of flying them over for the interview. And most laptops nowadays do come with a built-in camera and microphone, so it is a lot easier to conduct a virtual interview these days because you don't have to buy the extra equipment if you have newer equipment at home. So these are done over the internet. Again, they usually involve webcams and microphones and just different things like that, some audio and some video. They are usually done from home, and they are done with an interviewing or webinar specific site or program such as GoToMeeting, Zoom, JobVite, HireVue, and more. But interviewees do not need to have this software, so the interviewer would have it, and what they would end up doing would be to send you an email with a link and tell you to access it at a particular time and date, and there will also be a passcode to it too. Now, if you have a virtual interview who is using a program like Google Hangouts or Skype or something like that that you can get for free, that's usually a sign of a scammer, because again, those are free. Anybody can sign up for them. And another sign of a scammer too is they are reluctant to show their face. And they won't actually use voice. They usually do like to actual text chat in that setting. And so in a virtual interview, they will be using voice. They want to hear your voice. They want to see your face. So most are live interviews face to face. So it's like FaceTiming somebody. You see them on the screen talking. You can hear their voice as they speak. But there are some companies that use a method where they ask you the question. They might have the question written on top of the screen and you record yourself answering it. And that can actually be to your advantage because it does give you time to thoroughly think your answer through. And most of the time you have a chance to record it more than once just in case you make an error. And then it gets recorded and they review it later. Some special tips for virtual interviews. So always do a test run and make sure you're comfortable with your equipment and it is working properly. Sometimes technology doesn't work the way we want it to, and this way you can avoid any last-minute surprises. See if you can position your webcam so it mostly frames your head and shoulders, kind of like a portrait, and make sure you have a light source behind your webcam to illuminate your face. The interviewers do want to see your face, and if you have too much light behind you, you can appear as a silhouette, like you're trying to remain anonymous. Be especially cognizant of sources of background noise, and some of it we can't help if the neighbor's dog is barking or there's a leaf blower outside. But just make sure if it's within your home, if you can just reduce that if possible. And always dress like you would a regular interview from head to toe. So like in this picture, this is probably not a good idea because he has his laptop balanced very precariously on those pillows, but he is also not fully dressed. And this was actually taken by his son. This gentleman was interviewing with the BBC at the time, so had that laptop fallen, they would have seen that he wasn't completely in a suit from head to toe. So he was very much tempting fate in that picture. So always log in a little early to allow for any internet or technical issues that may arise. Sometimes when they ask you to log into a website at a certain time, it might want to, install or upload something, and that might go a little slower than you planned. So just log in a little early and give yourself some time so there's not a last minute scramble. So when answering a question, you do want to give the impression that you're giving them eye contact, and your first instinct would be to look at the screen. But sometimes, depending on where your webcam is positioned, it might look like you're looking down when you're looking at the screen. So locate where your webcam lens is and look at that when you're asking a question to give the impression that you're looking the interviewer in the face and making eye contact. So you were called for an interview. Now what? Always be prepared. Research the company. There's Glassdoor.com, which is wonderful because people talk about the interview process. They might write in and say, well, this is what I was asked and whether or not they accepted the offer, and they just talk about the whole process. So if the company is big enough, Glassdoor can be a very wonderful resource for that. And Kununu is like the European version of Glassdoor, and it's not as robust as Glassdoor is because it doesn't have as much information on it yet. And of course, there's always the company itself's website and Google and Indeed. And Google has a job board now where they do allow people to review their employer. So there is a wealth of information out there. And also salary.com, that can help you answer that dreaded salary question. That can be very tricky sometimes. So salary.com can at least give you an idea, and so actually can Glassdoor, of what the salary ranges are and what the company usually pays. So don't show up like the gentleman here in the comic, where he really believes his research abilities would be an asset to whatever this company is called. You don't want to show up like that because the employers want to know that you are interested in their company specifically. So what to wear? So jewelry, earrings for women only, not overly dangly or flashy. One ring per hand if you can limit it, and a scarf and a single string of pearls will always work. And shoes, just comfortable, shined, and not too high. Of course, it's most important that you can actually walk in them and that they don't cause you any discomfort. Makeup, less is more. And avoid any sort of fragrance, and this is both for women and men. Just avoid it entirely as possible because some people do have very strong allergies to fragrance. So hair, just conservative styles. Undershirts for men. And a suit is always nice in black, navy, or dark gray. A skirt suit or a pantsuit are equally acceptable. Now, some workplaces are more business casual. So, for example, if you were interviewing at a warehouse, you probably would not want to wear a suit. So some of it is just knowing your setting. But of course, you always do want to look nice for the interview. And so if you have a handbag, just leave in the car if possible and bring a small one with just the basics. And a few other things that it might be good to bring to the interview. A portfolio with a notepad and several copies of your resume. If you have networking business cards, that might be a good place to have them too. And also this way, when you gather business cards, you can just keep them in your portfolio so everything is neat and organized. And also if you wear reading glasses, just keep them handy where you can reach them easily and you're not digging around for them. So now you're actually at the interview. So these are just different questions and answers. And there are many different types of interview questions. There are the traditional interview questions, and we're going to go into these a lot more. Behavioral, and these are becoming a lot more commonplace. Hypothetical, critical thinking, and case interviews. So traditional interview questions, these are the ones we are most familiar with. Tell me about yourself, and this is a good time for your 30-second commercial. That makes that question a whole lot easier if you have your 30-second commercial prepared. They are interested in you telling them about yourself in a more professional manner. They usually don't want people to go into their personal life. It's more of a professional question. So where do you see yourself in 5 years? And with that question, it's always important to paint yourself as being active and hopefully working for their company. What are your 3 weaknesses and strengths? And that's a good one to have prepared ahead of time. And once you get into your weaknesses, it's always good to reframe them as strengths. How do you handle customer complaints? And that can also be a behavioral question depending on how they frame it. How do you sell someone? So behavioral interviewing, and this is becoming more and more common, and I think anybody who has ever been on a job interview has come across a behavioral interview question. They are based off of the best predictor of the future being the past, and they focus more on doing rather than having. It focuses more on the soft skills. They ask for specific examples, how they were handled, and what the outcome was. So behavioral question typically is something like, tell us about a time you had a disagreement with a coworker. What did you do and what was the outcome? So they ask you to tell them about a time. They ask you to set up the situation, what actions you took, and how everything turned out. So similarly here, give me an example of a time you were not able to complete a project before the deadline, and how did you handle it, and what was the outcome? So sticking to the STAR method is very helpful when you are responding to behavioral questions. And the S and the T in STAR stand for situation or task. And so this is where you set up your answer and you set up the story. So it's the details about the situation or the task. And of course you want to be detailed, but also be as brief as you possibly can. What led up to the situation or task and who was involved? And A is your action. What was your particular role and what did you do? And R is the result. It's the outcome. And what was the outcome? That's sort of the end of the story. Hypothetical questions differ from behavioral questions because they don't ask you to draw upon past experience. So in this case here, suppose you were on a project that you quickly realized was going to go over budget if you included everything you were asked to, and how would you handle the situation? They're not really asking for an example of how it happened in the past, although you can, if you wanted to, frame it as a behavioral question. But this way it's okay if you don't really have that past experience. It's, of course, hypothetical. So if you were to have any kind of parade in the office, what kind of parade would it be? And that was actually a question asked by the shoe website Zappos. And I've also seen on supermarket applications, they ask if you could be any kind of food, what kind of food would you be? And sometimes that's just to kind of see how creative you are, see what you would come up with. Just like in this cartoon here, if you were a bird, what kind of bird would you be? And he answered a hypothetical one. So case study and critical thinking questions, we don't usually see these as often. So these are just some examples. How would you introduce a new type of electric car to a foreign market? And what are some risks and benefits you would have to consider? Or maybe there's a toy company who's been struggling with declining sales and they're trying to hire somebody to help mitigate that. And they're planning to introduce several new product lines as a solution. And so you would develop a marketing strategy for one of the product lines, and they would most likely have information about what the product lines are so you can develop a strategy for those. So what are employers looking for? And the most important thing, first and foremost, is they called you into the interview because they liked your qualifications. They wanted to know more about you. And it is just as important, if not more, that they feel you are someone they would like to see in the office every day. And at the Senior Source, we've had a lot of guest speakers from a lot of different human resources backgrounds, and sometimes they give a lot of differing pieces of advice, but that is one thing that they all agree on, is that the soft skills, the personality, and things like that can make or break an interview. And sometimes they will hire a person who is less qualified if they feel like that person is a better fit for the company culture. So they're looking for things like confidence, personality, enthusiasm, work ethic, dedication, and ability to work with others. Again, these are all more the soft skills. And again, it always bears repeating, that's just the most important thing they're looking for. Top interview bloopers. Poor handshake. So you want to have a firm handshake. You don't want to crush their hand, but you don't want to be the limp fish either. Talking too much. And that is a very easy trap to fall into because a lot of us, we have a lot of experience that is relevant to what we're interviewing for. We want to share it all. So it might be good to just kind of summarize it and then just ask the interviewer, would you like to hear more? Would you like me to go into more depth? So that way you kind of let them take the lead. Talking negatively about past employers or jobs. And we've all had that bad boss or that bad job somewhere in our professional life. But if you talk negatively about them in an interview, it will make the employer wonder if you would talk negatively about them if they hired you. Showing up too late or too early. And of course, you don't want to show up late, but you don't want to show up too early either. About 15 minutes early would be fine. And if possible, before the interview, it might be good to kind of practice going out to the interview site. So that way you know what traffic would look like if there's any construction, because you know how that just kind of seems to pop up spontaneously. Just different things like that so you're comfortable with, you know where the building is, you know what side of the street it's on, and just different things like that. Just makes it a whole lot easier and less stress. Being rude to the gatekeeper, that can be the receptionist, the janitor, just anyone who works there. Asking about salary or benefits too soon. It's usually a good idea to let them bring it up, because if you ask about salary or benefits too soon, it makes it look like that is what you're concerned about. Instead of working for them and contributing to their team, you're just more concerned about salary or benefits. And being unprepared can also give off the impression that you're not really interested in working for them, you're just there for a paycheck. Verbal tics, you know, like, and we do those without thinking. So if you find interview questions to practice, it might be good to record yourself even on your cell phone. Most of them have a recording capability now, and just see how you do, because we do that without realizing it. Not enough or too much eye contact. So eye contact is important. You don't want to not look at them because it does make you look a little bit dishonest, but if you have too much, that can kind of have a detrimental effect as well. Failure to match communication styles. So if that person is more formal, you want to reflect that back at them. If they're more laid back, you want to reflect that back at them as well. Not being ready when the interviewer comes out to greet you, if that's the restroom, running to your car or something like that, just make sure you're ready when it comes time for the interview and that you're ready to go back with the interviewer, because you don't want the interviewer to come out and you're just not there. So interviewing questions, appropriate versus inappropriate, and what to do if you are asked an inappropriate question. And I added this because over the years of teaching this interviewing workshop, I had a lot of clients come with stories of interviewers that just asked things that were inappropriate or just outright illegal. They stuck their foot in the mouth like the baby in the picture has. So sticky subjects, it's just not a good idea to go there. Age, gender, race, color, or national origin, marital and or parental status, just anything related to your family. Religion and disability, although religion might come up if it's a religious organization. But it is all in the wording, so there are appropriate ways of approaching some of these topics. So it isn't appropriate to ask for a year when you graduated college. It is okay to ask if you have a college degree. Asking about arrests is inappropriate. That is off of limits because sometimes people have been arrested. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity, but they were never charged with anything. It is okay to ask, have you ever been convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor? Because some jobs, they are more case by case. What is your date of birth? It is appropriate to ask, can you furnish proof of age upon employment? Where are you from originally? Can also be, do you speak any foreign languages? Are you a U.S. citizen? Although the government jobs like the census, that was a major hiring criteria. So they did ask, are you a U.S. citizen? But typically, Are you eligible to work in the U.S. is a much more appropriate question, unless it is a job where citizenship is required, which you do see a lot in the government. Tell me about your disability. And that is a very, very slippery slope, but it is okay for them to ask, are you able to perform the job as described? Do you have to take care of any family members at home? Can become, do you have any responsibilities that may conflict with attendance? So if you're asked an illegal or inappropriate question, what should you do? And some interviewers, they're just not aware that it's inappropriate. And some of them, maybe they are, and they're just hoping that you're not aware. But there are some ways around it if you are asked an illegal or inappropriate question. So you can answer the intent of the question, like the tell me about your disability. You can always counter that with, I am able to perform the job as described. I'm aware of what the job is and I applied for it, fully aware of what the job is, for example. Or the question about, do you have family members at home that you need to take care of? You can just answer, well, I am capable of doing the job as scheduled, as outlined in the job description. So always emphasize that you're capable of doing the job. You can change the subject entirely. You can answer it as is anyway, or you can just refuse to answer it. And that just all depends on how you feel like the interview is going. So closing the interview, things went well and now it's wrapping up. Always ask questions though, even if you feel like they answered everything. So you can ask, how would you describe a typical day at this job? And that's a good question because it makes you look like you are envisioning yourself in that job, and that's a very, very good angle to take. What do you expect me to accomplish in the first 90 days on the job? Again, that shows them that you're envisioning yourself at that job. What is the onboarding process like for new hires? What are the most important qualities needed to excel in this role? And just a few last things. Ask what the next step is and when they plan on making a decision. And always tell them why you're excited to interview for them, why the position is the right one for you, or maybe even why the company is one you're excited about. And emphasize that you're looking forward to the next step. And always thank them with a handshake and a smile. After the interview, follow up. So follow-up do's. This is what to do when following up. So do ask the employer when they plan to make a decision and follow that lead when you are following up. So if they say 2 weeks, wait 2 weeks until you try to contact them. Send a thank you letter or email, and both of them are equally acceptable to everyone who interviewed you. Now, if you are interviewed by a panel, send an individualized note or email to them. Don't send them a form letter or copy them on the same email. Send an individualized thank you to each one of them. Do alert your references to possible phone calls or emails so that way they can make sure to read the email or pick up the phone when they see the strange number. And do follow up to see if a hiring decision has been made by either phone or email, just however they prefer. And you can even ask, how would you prefer that I follow up? But always stick to the time frame they gave you. And do be patient. Sometimes things come up. Maybe someone unexpectedly had to go out of the office. And so sometimes hiring processes take longer than anticipated. So it is always important to be patient. Follow up don'ts. Don't burn any bridges if you don't get an offer, and especially because we've seen HR people, recruiters and hiring managers, sometimes they move companies and they typically tend to stay within the same industry. So if it's a industry that you're interested in, just make sure not to burn any bridges because you never know when you're going to come up and see that person again. Do not place too much emphasis on one job interview. There will be other opportunities, and it's always good to have many irons on the fire until you accept a job. So again, don't stop your job search until you take a job offer. And don't be pushy or sound desperate, and that can be extremely difficult, especially if you've been unemployed for a long time. Now, we do offer different methods of interviewing preparation at the Senior Source. We do have mock interview days or just individual mock interviews. We've done group mock interviews, and we can do it over the phone, virtually, or in person. And also, if you have an interview coming up and you just want to sit down and kind of talk about it, maybe go over some questions, we can also do that as well. So just call 214-525-6145 or email me. My name is Kim at kmarkman@theseniorsource.org. Thank you very much.